still with us straight from Washington, D.C. The extremely bright Mr. Olivier Knox, the soon-to-be Doctor of History, Mr. Arash Azizi from California, and here in our 24 News studios in Tel Aviv, the brilliant Miss Carrie Keller-Lynn. And now we're shifting focus to this.
Impartiality is fundamental to fair journalism, maintaining a level of fairness so the viewer is confronted by one whole, not just skewed, fragmented parts. But the recent Russian invasion of Ukraine has demonstrated a significant shift in reporting, with the morality and judgment of the journalist changing how the conflict has been represented. Israeli media has also come under criticism for its overexposure of conflict, such as explicit coverage of raids in the West Bank. So, when is it acceptable for the media to take sides in light of war? And where do we draw the line when it comes to reporting?
So should war reporting take a side? Same game plan here, 30 seconds each, and then we debate. Carrie, take the lead.
I think my position is quite simple. Journalists have a duty to tell the truth. Impartial means telling the truth and doing it with accuracy. It does not mean bending over backwards to find some sort of balance between narratives, especially in the case of Ukraine and Russia, when there's a very clear moral case for one that I think is not quite controversial for me to say right now, unless, of course, I were speaking on Russian media. And in fact, I think this is something that we see in Israel as well, in terms of people who report on Israel, and I believe there's this strong sense of need to find a balance and an explanation between the two sides, and sometimes accuracy is just telling it like it is.
Yes, and we'll continue the discussion in a second, but Arash, your take first.
Look, I used to work in BBC where you are legally required to be impartial. I would say impartiality is a myth. It's a nonsense myth. There's no such a thing as impartial. Of course, you can be truthful, but there are many different sources of being truthful. And look, I support Ukraine in this war, because it's a country that is having its territory violated. But I can't say that there is a moral case, only for Ukraine. There can be different cases. But impartiality is not true. What we need is fairness. Fairness in media and a diversity of views is necessary. But I don't believe in such a thing as impartiality. I don't even think it's possible.
Olivier, the floor is yours.
I think this question is asked at a really excellent time. There are a lot of voices in the American news media that are calling into question objectivity, and they're calling it into question on two grounds. One is the idea, of course, that we come to the table or the laptop or the TV studio with the accumulation of our personal experiences, and that helps us shape what we think of as news and how to cover it. And the other is this argument that one of the ways for the news media to recapture some of the trust that it has lost is to be a little bit more transparent about where individual journalists and individual publications, where they stand on the major issues of the day.
What can I say? I'm overwhelmed by your initial stances. I'm not sure where we should lead the debate next, but I would like us all to try and imagine going back to 1939 and seeing calls for a fair or impartial coverage of both sides of the divide. Would we want to live in such a scenario?
I think the scenario is a little bit different. The issue in 1939, I think, would be a similar issue that we're seeing in Ukraine and Russia today, which is also the issue of access. One side provides access and is able to be seen and criticized and reported on in a way that could feel accurate and fair to the person who's reporting, and the other side is quite deliberately cloaking itself in shadow. And so when you go back to 1939, I'm assuming you're speaking about Europe, there were scenarios in which it was impossible for certain reporters to report accurately, although it was definitely achieved.
Yes, but Arash, how would we even feel if both sides of the conflicts or both sides of the divide were even sought to be fairly covered?
Look, fair is very different for me than impartial. I think one should always be fair. Yes, if I was a journalist covering the Nazi invasion of Poland, I would do it fairly. You would only need to report on what the Nazis were doing in order to be fair about it. And of course, there's also the question of, propaganda is part of the war. Communication is part of the war, and there's nothing wrong with when a war happens and you join one side. You try to push that side in certain ways. But then the job of the media, the question that will be posed is that the job of the media is, of course, exposition of truth. And doing so fairly. But there's no use in trying to pretend we are impartial. Well, how could you be impartial? If you covered, a terrorist attack in which children died, you're impartial. If you covered, many other situations, you're impartial. It's a lie. It's never true. And as I said in BBC, which is really the one who really tries to push that, it's effectively, it's, and not only it's, they usually sometimes say it's an ideal, we try to reach it, but I don't think it's a good idea at all.
So, Olivier, if we're not pretending anymore, what should be done next? What other boundaries or barriers should we establish for a fair, perhaps we'll use Arash's term, a fair media coverage?
Well, I think, first of all, the answer to your question is yes. We would want impartial coverage. Impartial doesn't mean that you pretend the two sides are equal morally, that their actions are the same, that their motives are the same, or anything like that. And it's come to mean that, and I'm not really sure where we get that. The idea of objectivity or impartiality is somehow at odds with telling the facts. I just disagree with that. One of the things that I'd like to sort of underline is there's a difference between being a slightly partial and being a cheerleader. One of the things that's very unsettling in watching a lot of the Ukraine coverage, it reminds me a little bit of when American anchors and reporters put flag lapel pins in their lapels after 9/11. It reminds me a little bit now of seeing reporters wearing variations on the blue and gold of the Ukrainian flag. I think you can report accurately and fairly without buying wholeheartedly into things like the ghost of Kyiv. And so I think we have to keep our readers and our viewers foremost in our minds as the people to whom we're trying to tell a story, not the people for whom we're performing.
But on the flip side of that, we have Russian state media claimed to be an arm, propaganda arm of President Vladimir Putin, often using fake news or lies to distribute their narrative. So where's the middle ground here?
I don't know that we need a middle ground. I mean, the Russian state media. I mean, you saw what they've done in terms of suppressing any dissident messages. You saw Vladimir Putin's crackdown on independent media. You saw the new law that punishes even calling this a war with potentially 15 years in prison. So we certainly don't need to take that approach or that side. But what we do need to have is, a clear-eyed vision of what's going on the ground in Ukraine as possible, reporting as fairly and as fully on what, say, President Biden is doing to manage the conflict. I really don't think this is. I don't think impartial and telling the truth are as far apart as some folks who criticize us seem to think.
Right, solid point there. And Carrie, we really can't have this discussion without mentioning Israel if we're discussing fair coverage or lack thereof. What's your take on the way Israel and its conflicts, plural, are being covered in that sense?
I think my point really goes back to access. When you're speaking about Israel's conflicts, you're speaking about Israel versus Hamas or Israel versus the Palestinian Authority, both of which are considerably less able to be covered openly by journalists. Hamas and the Palestinian Authority actually, sometimes journalists in the region will quip that it's fun to work with them because they'll roll out the red carpet, but they'll only give you a very small set of facts, whereas Israel might not treat journalists so kindly or favorably, but it's an open society with a free and open press, and you're able to obtain the information, you're able to move and see. And so I think that the access issue actually creates a distortion in that the side that provides more access in the case of Israel and Gaza and Israel and the Palestinian Authority is overcovered in a way. And sometimes we can lose the perspective. You mentioned fair, and everyone mentioned fairness. I think perspective is part of that too. I think sometimes the quest for impartiality makes us lose a perspective in that inappropriate toggle to find quote balance.
So Olivier, what's the next stage in order to not achieve balance, but to create a better surrounding in this respect?
Well, I think there's an organic process going on right now in American newsrooms at any rate, where again, objectivity is being called into question. The idea of story choice reflecting personal backgrounds of editors and reporters, deciding what is news, reflecting our backgrounds as well. And so there's this big conversation going on. As an American reporter, Franco-American reporter, I definitely would prefer the organic process to some kind of top-down order. I get the heebie-jeebies whenever government steps in to say this is news and this is not.